staff and students. Good. So this workshop's really going to focus on developing lines of argument in your thesis. And I think one of the things we see as examiners is that sometimes a thesis or a dissertation is quite strong on description, but sometimes lacks argument. So that gave me the idea of trying to look at the lines of argument within a thesis and how we can strengthen those. So that's what we're going to try to do today. So if I can just show you the overall sort of plan for today. We'll start by talking about the purpose of the workshop, and then look at what is an argument and what is a thesis, because those are two really important words for the workshop. And then we'll go on to look at different kinds of argument within a thesis. And we'll start by looking at the argument from the rationale, and look at what kind of argument that is. And then go on to the literature review, the theory or theoretical framework or conceptual framework, and then move on to the methodology, and then what I call the thesis argument, which is really the main argument of the thesis. And then we'll conclude by talking about how they link to each other, and what the relation is between these different lines of argument. Okay. So the purpose is to develop an understanding of different lines of argument within a research study, and to apply this understanding to your own research study. So I think some of you are busy with masters, some are busy with PhDs, and perhaps some of you are busy with articles or other kinds of publications. I think it's relevant to all of those things in different ways. And it's going to be quite an interactive workshop. So I'm going to ask you to think about these lines of argument in relation to your own studies. And we'll have a chance, I've got a worksheet for you where you can actually fill in the lines of argument that you're following at these different levels, or you can think about what they are if you haven't thought about them yet. Right. So I hope by the end of the workshop you'll have quite a clear sense of these 5 different lines of argument and how they apply to your particular studies. Is that okay? Does it make sense? Okay. Right, so just to start off with, I just want to talk about what is an argument. And it's quite a complex word with many different meanings. I have got a sheet with the stuff on which I'll hand out to you in a minute, so don't worry about getting all the information now. But the common understanding of an argument is a disagreement between people. But in an academic context, it's got a different meaning, or different shades of meaning. The one is, if you have a look at number 6, the subject matter or the theme of the thesis or the article. So you'd say the central argument of his paper was presented clearly. So that's the main sort of idea that you're developing through the paper. But there's also another important meaning, which is number 3, and that is a process of reasoning. So it's not only the theme or the main theme, but it's the process of developing that theme by giving reasons or giving evidence to support that argument as you develop it through your paper or your thesis. So it's a kind of combination of those two things. On the one hand, a main idea, or some people would call it a statement or a proposition. Okay. So you're saying this is the case. Right. So perhaps in management you'd say this particular model of management is appropriate for this kind of company. Okay. And then the line of argument would be the reasons and the evidence you give to support that contention. Does that make sense? Okay, right. So let's go on to, just to give you an example. So for example, this thesis argues that becoming a learning organization can contribute to the sustainability of small IT companies. Right. So you see it's a kind of a proposition that's linking different factors. On the one hand, it's got a small IT company, and then a learning organization, and then sustainability. And it's making a connection between those things. So that's the argument. If we move on to a thesis, we can say that it's really an argument that's supported by certain reasons. So you can see here the example. It's the same example. So the thesis argues that becoming a learning organization can contribute to the sustainability of small IT companies because of these factors. Team learning, personal mastery, and systems thinking increase innovation and flexibility. Right. So that would be your thesis that you're presenting, and then through your thesis, you're presenting evidence and building a case for your thesis. Right. And that would be the line of argument that runs right through your thesis. So in a way, we would call this the thesis argument. This is what you end up with at the end of your thesis. You end up with a strong proposition that you've proved. And then you might restate that in your abstract. And it should somehow link to the title of your thesis. Right. So perhaps the title would be small IT organizations as learning organizations, something like that. And then this is what you're saying about that topic. And then through the thesis, you're building the case for it. Okay. Now, I suppose what I'd like you to do is start to think about your own study. Okay? Are you starting to do that?
Yes.
Right. So you're starting to make a connection, thinking about what might be your thesis, and what is the argument, and what are the reasons or evidence that you have to support that argument, and how do you build it through your thesis or your dissertation or your paper. Right. And I'll give you a chance to we'll come back to that and explore it in more depth. But that's the overall idea. Now, what we find is that quite often in students' work, this is not very clear. You know, the student will describe, give a lot of description of the data, but not really pull it together in the form of an argument. And I think that's one of the things that distinguishes a fair piece of work from a very good piece of work. If you've got a clear sense of the argument and you can pull it right through the thesis. Okay, so that's what I'm hoping to develop in this workshop. Okay, so if we go back to these different lines of argument and just to clarify them, and then we'll look at each one in much more detail and give you a chance to think about it in relation to your own thesis. So the first one is really the rationale. And the rationale is an argument which is a justification for your study. So you're justifying your topic. You're giving reasons why it's important to do the study. And typically this would appear in your first chapter, in your introduction. Okay. I'm doing the study for these reasons. This is why it's important. And we'll look at some of the reasons that you might give for that. Are you familiar with that sort of argument? Okay, I'm sure you've got that in your thesis if you. Right. The second one is really around the literature. And the literature is typically making a case for situating your study in relation to the broader scholarship within your field. So what you're saying is, this is how my study fits in to the field of scholarship. Right? This is what it's contributing. And it might be building on something or addressing a gap or presenting something new. But you're making an argument for why your study is important in relation to the scholarship. Okay. So again, a literature review is really should be an argument, okay? Not just a survey or a list of themes, but linking those themes and making a case for your particular focus in your study. Right, so that's the second line of argument, the literature. The third one is around theory. And this is really about justifying the theory that you're using in your study. Right? So you're saying, I'm using, for example, this theory of learning organizations. And it's appropriate for these reasons. So you're making a case for your theory or the concepts that you're using.
Can I ask a
Sure.
question? Yeah. Both of those arguments, thanks, Brian. Arguments 1 and 2,
Yes.
We typically lump into a survey of literature.
Yes. Yes.
But both of those can be reasonably proximate if you are not necessarily developing upon something which is very clearly stated in the literature.
Yes. Yes.
But that's always left me a little jagged, if you like, because we come from a very positivist frame of reference in the School of Management, and that appears to be slowly changing. I think I'm right here, Brian, but I was planning to Given about this a couple of weeks ago, and we seized upon grounded theory as an approach in the absence, but it's inappropriate because grounded theory is something which leans heavily upon a qualitative frame of reference, and it's so would it be fair to say, I think I'm asking this, would it be fair to say that there are no absolutes there?
Yes. Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, I think that there's often a clear overlap between the rationale argument and the literature review argument. They often have some similar components, and we'll have a look at some examples. Yeah. So some studies would provide their entire rationale from the literature, and then in a way those would be the same argument. But others would include other factors within the rationale which might be a bit different from the literature.
It's also then fair to say that in terms of justifying your theoretical approach, your justification is not an argument based only upon current theory, but also upon construct and concept.
Yes,
okay.
Certainly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And as we'll see, the theory often also overlaps with the literature. Quite often you have a literature review chapter which brings in theory and perhaps develops a theoretical framework or conceptual framework. Right. So they're linked, but I think it's sort of conceptually useful to separate them, and we'll see how that works.
Okay.
And you can decide how useful it is for your particular study.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, then the fourth argument is around methodology. And again, quite often what happens is in a dissertation or a thesis, the student will present the methodology. So saying, this is what I'm going to do, but what's really important is to provide a justification. So why have you chosen this methodology? Because as we know, there's multiple possibilities. You can do a study in many different ways. You might do a case study or a survey, or a pre-test and a post-test, or action research, and you have to provide a justification about why your way is appropriate, and therefore present an argument. Did you want to say that? Okay, right. So that's the fourth line of argument. And then the fifth one is the one that we started with. That's the thesis argument. So that's related to your main findings and what that says about your topic. Right? And usually you can summarize that in a sentence or two. Right? So for example, the example I gave about IT companies as learning organizations leads to sustainability. Right? And all your evidence and findings would hopefully support that. Right? So it's like a conclusion which is stating in a propositional form what you found out about the topic. Okay, but we'll come back to each of these and look at it in more detail. But do you have a sense of the whole framework? I just wanted to show you a diagram. So I'm using the word lines of argument. Right. So what that suggests is that you develop it through a process of argument. So it's a line of argument that runs through the thesis. And so I'm using arrows there to show that the argument might start in a particular place, but then it moves forward and supports the other lines of argument. So for example, your rationale might be picked up in the literature review, and it's slowly building the argument for your study. The theory as well might come out of the literature review and be building up, and then you'd apply the theory and the methodology within your data analysis, and then that contributes to your thesis argument. Okay, so they're all linked, and they can work together, and it's good to think about it like that. How is my rationale supporting my literature and theory? How am I using my methodology and theory to analyze data to support my thesis argument? Okay. Right. So that's the big picture. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go and look more specifically at each of these lines of argument and give you a chance to think about it for your own study. Right. So if we just start with the argument one, which is the rationale. Right. So as I was saying, the rationale is really the justification for your study. Why your study is important and why it's worth doing. And the rationale might take different forms. So for example, you might say, I'm doing this topic because it's a burning issue in South Africa, right? Or it's a pressing matter which needs attention. That might be one line of argument. So the example I was giving yesterday is that one of the emerging issues in South Africa is that there's this vast gap between what managers earn and what workers earn. Right? And some people are beginning to question that now, with the strikes, Marikana, and so on. So you might say, I'm investigating, differential pay formats because it's a pressing issue in the country. That might be one kind of rationale. Okay. A second one might be a gap in the scholarship. So this is related to the literature. You might say, my study is important because it's addressing a gap in the literature. Because other people have looked at this and this and this, but no one's looked at that. So you're kind of creating a niche for your study. And you can see that those first two might be related. Right? So you might say, this is a pressing matter in South Africa or Africa, but it hasn't been given attention in the literature. So that would sort of strengthen that kind of rationale. And then a third line of argument might be, and we were not sure about how this applies to management, but you might say, I have got particular expertise or experience in this area. So you might say, I've been working on this issue for 10 years or 20 years through my experience as an academic or as a manager in an IT company. And therefore, I've got a particular interest in it or investment in it. And that might be a line of argument. Okay. Yes?
The question now is, I can buy the first two and embrace them very happily. The third one, is this not just an exercise in indulgence?
Exercise in indulgence.
Exercise in indulgence.
Yes.
Because I have 3 decades of interest and experience and in a wide variety of fields. As I say, I could buy the first two. What proportions would you say are acceptable in terms of justifying what it is you intend studying? In other words, would you say that's a 40-40-20 or a 50-30-20 or whatever? Brian, you can comment over here as well. I think this is a crucial one.
Okay, good. I'm not going to give a percentage to them because I think it depends on the study. It depends on the kind of study that you're doing. And I'll give you an example now, just to show you what I mean. This is an example of one of my students who's looking at chronic illness among higher education students. Okay? And it's particular kinds of chronic illnesses that are often hidden. For example, chronic fatigue syndrome. Okay? And she's someone who's experienced this for a long time. So have a look at her rationale. So she's saying, as someone who has lived with chronic illness whilst trying to further my education, I've often felt alone, disbelieved, misunderstood, disheartened, and frustrated. Their story is my story, and it's a story that needs to be told. Right. So there she's saying, I have this experience. Okay. But that's not all she's saying. She's then looking at the literature and saying, despite the growth of interest in widening access, the voices of disabled students themselves have hardly been heard. So there's a gap in the literature around people with disabilities. Right. And then she's saying, by exploring these students' storied lives, one can gain a better understanding of the functioning and needs of this under-researched group. This may have important implications for how universities will gain access to and help these students in the future. So do you see how she's combining different kinds of rationales? And because her study is a qualitative study where she's using narrative methodology, it's kind of acceptable to refer to your own experience, because that way of doing research acknowledges the importance of the subject. Right? You wouldn't use this rationale if you're doing a survey, for example. Okay, so the rationale has to fit in with the broader paradigm that you're using. Okay, yes. Did you want to say something?
You can't do this at age 25 or 30.
Right.
I think it'll be more difficult.
What's the
except perhaps in the
H25
social-
and
Except perhaps in the social sciences, when you're writing a personal narrative, as this might be.
right?
In management science, I think our obligation is to make a contribution to management practice.
Yes.
So I could say, I've often felt alone, disbelieved, misunderstood, disheartened, and frustrated as a victim of UKZN management practice. This is my story,
Yes.
but it is my intention to alter the nature of management practice in my school, college, and the university as a whole.
Yes.
It's dangerous territory, but it is a personal interest area, but I don't think I could phrase it quite like that,
Yes.
depending on where I was trying to publish this.
Yeah. Okay. So that's what I'm saying is that you need to look at what's appropriate for your discourse and your disciplines. Okay. This would fit into certain kinds of studies, but wouldn't be acceptable in other kinds of studies. Right. So the rationale is dependent on the discourse, actually, and what counts as knowledge or acceptable practice within the discourse. But, okay, so you're starting to think about that anyway, and then you can apply it to your own particular context. Right. So what I'd like you to do now is if...
Could you thought
sure.
maybe after you?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, in that regard, how can you actually be able to do research and actually show objectivity instead of like being biased in terms of like giving an argument? Like how do you get into that rationale of arguing without actually having to take one side and be objective and actually looking at the matter?
Yes. Well, you see, within an interpretivist paradigm, okay, so within this particular way of doing research, it would acknowledge the importance of the subject. Right? So saying that there's no such thing as an absolute objectivity. What you have to do is acknowledge your own position and think about how your position will affect the research. And that can be an actual resource in the research. So, for example, in this case, this person has a particular insight into the issue.